Nowco and I both attended the very first North American cohort of Karuna Training starting 10 years ago in Berkeley, California. So previous to that, Karuna Training was primarily in Europe, entirely in Europe. And so we were both in that first cohort, and we attended the full 3-year program and then became faculty over time. What first drew me to Karuna Training was one of its most unique offerings. So we do a practice. Part of what we offer in Karuna Training is something called Maitri Space Awareness. Maitri means loving kindness and space awareness. And that practice, it can seem pretty esoteric and weird. It involves taking postures and putting on colored glasses and really digging into the energy of the elements and feeling those energies and then engaging with them. I had done that practice a couple of times and I really loved it. And Karuna Training was one of the only ways, other than going to Naropa University in Boulder, to be able to dive deeper into that practice. But when I went to the introductory program, I realized that I did at the time and still do a lot of work with other people's minds. I do a lot of holding space for people one-on-one and in groups. I teach photography and writing as contemplative practices. I do a lot of social justice activist work. And so I realized, oh, this could be very helpful, these practices, for me to hold my own mind and for me to work with holding other people's minds with loving kindness. I believed in what Karuna Training calls intrinsic health. So everyone's intrinsic capability to be especially mentally well, and that we have very limited concept about what is healthy in the psychological world. And so I really wanted to broaden my understanding of that. And I understood the idea, but I didn't really quite believe it yet. So Karuna Training helped me really get some experience with that. And then I became faculty because I wanted to keep applying. I got a lot of personal growth out of Karuna, and I wanted to keep applying these methods to larger societal change as well. I'll pass it to you now, Ko.
Yeah, thank you. So I am one of the faculty for Karuna Training. I'll be part of the basic training program that we'll talk about at the very end. But I started my formal meditation practice in 2007 in the Vajrayana tradition. And I guess what I could say what attracted me or what intrigued me about Karuna Training is this idea of intrinsic health. And in Karuna, the basic premise is that every single person is fundamentally awake and healthy. Every single person has the basic ability to be present and open and wise, and seeing everyone in spite of the evidence that that may not be true, right? So we call intrinsic health or basic sanity. It's like this kernel of resilience, right? Something so wholesome that we can draw on no matter what is happening with tremendous open heart. And this is really a radical view, right? I really think something like this is much needed in our world today with everything that's been happening. And this can be applied not just to individuals, but also to groups, to communities, to organizations. And we can really strive towards a basic sense of healthiness in a system and care for this world and for one another. So in Karuna, we're really trying to sort of open that up a little bit. And Miriam and I both experienced deep personal transformation coming out of Karuna Training. And we're both very interested in multifaceted, engaged Buddhism. We wanted to apply Karuna practices to our internal emotional experiences as well as our external activist work.
Thank you, Nowco. So what are we doing here today? First, Nowco and I will engage in a conversation about the paradox of identity, right? So this is the subject of our introduction to contemplative psychology today. And you are very welcome to ask questions throughout that conversation. So you can put something in the chat if you're staying on mute, or if that's easier for you. You can raise your hand and we'll see you. You can use the raise hand function. If you raise your actual physical hand, it might be harder for us to see you because we're in spotlight mode. You can also just unmute and say hello and throw in a question, but probably easiest to do it through the chat. And then we'll do some practice together. We'll have some practice time, guided practice. And then we'll have a group discussion And at the end, we'll take some time to introduce the upcoming basic program, the cohort that's beginning in late September that Freddie and Kyle both mentioned, and we'll answer some questions about that. So that's the layout. And we'll take a break about halfway through so that you can stretch, use the restroom, whatever you need. And we'll do some movement practice as well.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam, for that introduction. And so Miriam and I have been wanting to have a conversation about identity for a long time. And we've had several discussions on what aspect of it we wanted to focus on because it is a big topic. But a couple of months ago, I joined a conversation about whether social justice is part of the Buddhist teachings. Some of you may have heard the criticisms Buddhist organizations received for being silent on the Gaza situation. And I think in general, taking a stand on issues of justice, of injustice, is not something we often see in Western Buddhism. But when it comes to Buddhist teachings, and they say Buddha gave 84,000 teachings, right? But those teachings really can be kind of boiled down to one thing, and that is freedom from suffering. So when we look at our world today, suffering includes genocide, racism, sexism, climate change, polarization, and so on and so forth, right? We don't often talk about these issues, and specifically, like how can we apply Buddhist teachings to alleviate that suffering? But even the Buddha taught that everyone has the potential to achieve enlightenment in a caste society, and that was their form of racism of their time. So at this gathering, I asked the question, when it comes to suffering, why do we focus more on the personal and individual level in Western Buddhism when many of us, particularly people of color like myself, suffer from systemic injustice? And then a white man mentioned, and he responded by saying that we suffer because of our belief in our own identity that needs to protect itself. And that separates ourselves from others.
Hmm. That's a really interesting response. What did you say?
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? Because I was talking about the suffering that we experience due to our social locations, in particular backgrounds and identities. And this man was talking about how our attachment to particular identities is the very cause of suffering. So, which is true, right? Who is right?
So great. Paradox number one. Welcome to the paradox of identity. Right. So I was reading a book by Charles Johnson, who's a Black Buddhist scholar and writer. And he was saying that asking asking who is right, not in this particular situation, but asking who's right when you're dealing with a paradox is like asking which kind of physics is right. Newtonian physics, which is like apple falls, hits you on the head, gravity physics, or quantum physics, which is much more what happens on the microatomic level. Both are actually true, even though they apparently contradict each other at times. And depending on the context you're using, one's going to be more important than the other. One's going to stand forward and be more relevant. Not more important, but more relevant, I should say. So I wanted to mention that because that was like, right, this is about actually, these are both things that we consider basically true at this point, assumed to be true, quantum physics and Newtonian physics, and yet they often contradict each other. In Dharma teachings, so in the teachings of Buddhism, in the teachings of the Buddha, this kind of difference between talking about identity as something that causes us suffering and talking about how we experience suffering because of our attachment to suffering versus because of our social location in a bigger situation, that difference is the difference between the relative and the absolute. Relative and the absolute. So relative is I always think of relative as being relational, right? It's your relatives. It's the level of our everyday level of direct experience. So for instance, as Nauka was mentioning, generally people of color, people of the global majority, suffering more from systemic injustices. which is a bit like apples falling on our head. It's an actual, true part of reality that we need to not deny. On that level, our identities matter. They do, in fact, matter. It matters what our social location and experience of suffering is. Absolute is the bigger picture, where the suffering, and this is what the white man was responding, this is where our suffering comes from attachment to identity and everything else, not only identity, but everything else that we get attached to. On that level, we actually exist interdependently with each other. So on the absolute level, we are basically all equal in the eyes of suffering, right? We all suffer, and none of us exist independently from each other. So our identity, our individual identities aren't as significant at that level, which is again like quantum physics. Apples falling, not so much a relevant issue at that level. Both of these things can be true at the same time. So for me, a personal example of this, especially showing the complexity of the relative level, is an example some of you may have heard. So I did a podcast recently for Karuna Training on queerness. And I mentioned, as I said earlier, that I teach contemplative writing as a practice. And in one of those groups, we were sending emails back and forth, giving feedback on writing, supporting each other. And one person sent an email. I always address the group, "Hello, writers." And one person responded and said, "Hello, women." And someone replied and responded to the content of what they said, and then gently said, "Hey, I actually don't identify as a woman. I think it might be more accurate if we said, 'Hello, queers.'" And the person who had said "hello, woman" wrote back and said, "I don't identify as queer. I identify as a lesbian." And in the generation I grew up in, queer was still a really intense and negative experience to be called queer. And I was hospitalized for being a lesbian, put into a mental institution. And so it was so powerful. Here are all these nuanced identities in this group, right? And so in the end, I wrote back and I said, "Thank you so much for everyone for sharing, like, what's important for you to identify, which pronouns, what is your actual identity?" And then I said, "Can we just say hello, writers?" Because that's the level at which we are all clear that we are the same, right? So there are levels at which we are the same, levels at which we can all identify with each other. We're all human beings. On the absolute level, we're the same that way. But on all those relative levels, that doesn't mean they don't count. When I took one of my main Buddhist vows, so not every Buddhist, but some Buddhists take a bunch of different vows. When I took one of my main Buddhist vows, the teacher who was the person giving the vow took time to have an interview and talk with each of us ahead of time. And I asked him a ridiculously huge ask question. I said, "What's the most important thing for me to know as someone who is trying to commit to alleviate suffering for all beings?" So I was putting all this weight on him to tell me like the most important thing. And without a blink, he answered, "Go toward what seems to be paradoxical. Go toward paradox." He said, "Where we believe there's paradox, where we think that two things don't go together, that's probably where there's truth."
Mm. That's really brilliant. Yeah.
Super helpful.
Mm.
Yeah. And that's what I felt in that moment was like, these things should both be true. All these things can be true. The relative identities and absolute identity. And what can actually happen sometimes is that when we focus on we're all human beings, we skip out on a bunch of the relative experience. And there's actually a term for that called spiritual bypassing, which is when we use spiritual practice, in this case, Buddhism, to ignore the relative. And that happens a lot in white-led Buddhist communities, frankly, because we're kind of not aware of our identities. We're not aware that we have a race. And so we don't think it really matters, right? I'm cisgender. I happen to be married to someone who's transgender. So I'm pretty aware of queer issues. But if I were straight and if I didn't have a partner who was trans, I might not think that those are really important issues, right? So it becomes easy the less relative identity is threatened or is being challenged in everyday life or is a cause of suffering, the less likely we are to pay attention to that. And the more likely we are to just say, we're all human, we're all one. That's all that matters. And frankly, the relative level is kind of complex. So it also can maybe seem easier to just stay up at the absolute level, like we're all human beings, we're all the same. And as Naoko can share with us, it gets more complicated when we spend time on the relative level.
Yeah. So, Miriam just mentioned how the relative level can be very complex. And one aspect of that complexity regarding the relative identity is that it may include a lot of contradictions. So, I want to tell you a little bit about my identity. So, I'm from Japan, and today Japan is considered very safe and peaceful. We don't even get to call our military an army. We have to call it the Self-Defense Forces, because the Constitution drafted after World War II doesn't allow us to go to war. So growing up in Japan, I always saw the role of Japan's self-defense forces more as like a search and rescue team. They were always there when there was a natural disaster. But it's also true that Japan has a very violent history. We did horrible things to neighboring Asian countries under the name of Japanese imperialism during World War II. An example of this is the Nanking Massacre in China in the late 1930s. And the extent of that brutality of that massacre is shocking because it was primarily towards civilians and is considered one of the worst wartime atrocities. So that's in my blood, right? I carry that violent history of my ancestors from the past. And this is like the Asian version of colonizing other countries. That's part of my country's history.
Woo! I'm just really feeling that as you said that. And I really appreciate you owning that and feeling my own, not exact same experience, but resonance as a white person and all the violence that my ancestors have committed here.
Yeah. And another part of my identity is that I'm a person of color in this country. And I've experienced and witnessed racism against Asians, right, particularly after COVID. But as a foreigner living in America, over the years, I've had to become white. And this wasn't done consciously necessarily, it was more of a survival tool. So it was something I had to do to become accepted in white dominant culture. And what this means is that I took on the belief system, the values, the ideology of white dominant culture that includes the idea that white people are superior. And this is on a very subtle level, but it's there. So, on one level, while I'm a receiver of racism most of the time as a POC, as a person of color in this country, but at other times, I may be the perpetrator of racism because of the belief system of white dominant culture that I acquired. And this, for a long time, was very confusing for me. Identities are highly complex and at times very painful to deal with. And it's really challenging to even figure out how to talk about this. Right? These are multifaceted aspects of our lineage, of our ancestry, of our identities. And when you have you have all these different aspects that seem to kind of conflict with each other, there's both confusion and tension that arises. So it's really not the simple black and white thing.
Literally and more metaphorically, not a black and white thing. Yeah. Yeah. And as I mentioned earlier, I've been in Buddhist communities for 20 years in North America, and such a common thing to basically just not talk about it,
Yeah,
just not talk about it.
yeah, I've seen that a lot. And why do you think that happens?
Well, this is so Larry Yang, and I won't request labor from Kyle, but if Kyle wants to find this and put it in the chat, that's great. One explanation is given by a Buddhist teacher named Larry Yang, who's an Asian American teacher in the Insight tradition, and he has a fantastic book called Awakening Together. And he's the one of the folks many people of color have taken the great time and effort to labor and inform and instruct white folks who are not paying attention to these things. And one of the great ways that Larry Yang puts this is that those of us who have privileges, extensive privileges due to our identities, so white, cisgender, straight, male, think that identity isn't important. And if we even talk about identity, if we even talk about or address the issues that are coming up, because someone is being marginalized and they're suffering more because they're Black, Asian, or Indigenous, that means admitting that being white has an impact on other people's lives. And it means that being white has an impact on white people's lives too. So it's actually admitting, basically, if we say something about it, we have to admit that it's an issue. And facing whiteness is something that most white folks avoid, and something that a lot of spiritual communities, in my experience, don't have tools for. We don't even know how to approach it. In other words, there's less identity consciousness in white led spaces because there's less awareness that identity is even an issue. And we have a lot more to lose as a white person. I have a lot more to lose by bringing it up in the conversation. And I'm also much less likely to be aware of it. And this can also, again, seem like these issues around identity are not a part of Buddhist teachings because of the way the Buddhist teachings have been presented in the West by a lot of predominantly white teachers, is that identity on all of these levels and conversations about identity are not important. We're basically brilliantly sane, intrinsically healthy, good human beings.
Yeah. So I guess we're back to the paradox again, it seems. But I think Buddhism does offer some of the best tools for holding this complexity, right? Even when it feels unresolvable. So tools like mindfulness and compassion practice can really tap into this larger sense of absolute space, the absolute truth that we are all equal, while also being able to attend to the kind of tremendous discordant truths of our relative identities. And Miriam, you mentioned Larry Yang, but in the same book, Awakening Together, he talks about how the beauty of Dharma is that everything, and that includes all the particulars of our identities, is integral to our spiritual practice. And freedom is not just about transcending identity, but really embracing it until what is beyond that experience of identity reveals itself. And this is really true with much of our human experience, but this is not a linear process. And Larry also says spiritual freedom is not about privileging one truth over the other, or about imposing the absolute truth over the relative, or preferring the relative over the absolute, because to do so negates so much of what it means to be human in the simultaneous experience of our different cultural experiences and our common universal experience. So this is about honoring both.
It feels like my brain, even though we've talked about this for so long and we've read these quotes and we've had these conversations and practiced with it, my brain is still just like, how can those be true at the same time? Like a mental tongue twister or something. Like, how can I hold all of this at the same time? And I heard you also say like space, right? The space and compassion of practice holds room for that. This time I was able to actually give my own reference. So I'm going to mention a passage from Lama Rod Owens, who's one of my teachers. He's a Black queer teacher. He has a book that just came out recently called The New Saints. And he goes one step further to say, anything that is considered solely as an expression of the absolute, right? So we are all one, we're all human, we're all basically good, without the counterbalance of the relative, everything that Nauka was just talking about, right, in terms of our identity, can become an expression of violence. So anything considered solely as an expression of the absolute, without the counterbalance of the relative, will often become an expression of violence. A truer skillfulness does not privilege one extreme over the other, but binds both together. So we have a really similar theme here, right, of the both ands. What Lama Rada is pointing at is that we somehow believe that absolute and relative are actually separate from each other, that they're two separate things. And I remember when a teacher said to me, Charlene Leung, who's a Chinese American teacher who lives in the Bay Area, she and I were giving a program on identity a few years ago, and I was really grappling with absolute and relative. And she was like, they're not, stop. She got frustrated with me. She's like, stop treating them like they're different things. They're not different things. And that's where that physics quote now, just reading that physics quote a few weeks ago was like, oh, I get how they can be the same thing at the same time while looking very different from each other. So saying that absolute and relative are separate is like saying that you can't apply both Newtonian physics and quantum physics at the same time, but in fact, they are both true at the same time. And they're actually inherent to each other. And one of the things that's powerful, if I can go so far as to make a slight adjustment to what Larry Yang and Lamorad are saying, is that we actually don't need to bind the absolute and relative together. They're already together. The absolute and relative are not separate. It's that we treat them as if they are separate from each other, but we need to understand that they're connected. We need to actually come to that awareness and treat them that way. And we get there mainly through practice. If we weren't unique, we couldn't be the same. And if we weren't the same, we couldn't be unique. So there's that, again, that kind of tongue twister quality. And if your brain is hurting like mine, that's because it's a paradox. And practice is here to get us big enough to hold that. This is also a part of what Buddhist teachings call not one, not two. So this is an expression that's often used in Zen communities. We're all completely interdependent with each other. So we are not one, we are not separate. And we're all totally separate, unique human beings. We are not two. Sorry, we are not one because we're unique, and we're not two because we're actually all interconnected. And again, from Charles Johnson from Taming the Ox, he's quoting Huang Po. The enlightened person is capable of perceiving both unity and multiplicity without the least contradiction between them. So again, unity, we're all one, we're all together. Multiplicity, we're all separate and unique without the least contradiction between them. No one, I'm not personally in this session looking to become enlightened, and I hope y'all aren't pressing for that. But I think that's a pretty great description. Like, imagine what it would be like, even just for a moment, to be able to hold unity and multiplicity at the same time. And when we can have enough space to hold, remember what the person who gave me my vow said, apparent paradox. It appears like a paradox. When we have enough space, we realize there's actually not a paradox at all.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, so thank you, Mary. That's a really excellent summary of the paradox of the absolute and relative. And I'm also reminded of a quote from Sebede Selassie's book, You Belong. She says, although we are not one, we're not separate. And although we're not separate, we're not the same. So again, really pointing to what we've been talking about here. So where do we go from here then? Right? How do we navigate between these two truths that are so intertwined and both true? And how do we bridge the paradox that we are influenced by a number of contradicting relative identities, and at the same time, we are not these identities, both individually and collectively, and we're more than just these identities. So how do we build the capacity to hold both? And unfortunately, I don't think there are any easy answers. This is the kind of stuff that we really want to begin looking at the complexity of it all and keep asking the questions, keep grappling with it. And this continual seeking, this continual grappling will help us better navigate through the complexities of our identity so that ultimately we can come to a deeper understanding of ourselves and accept all aspects of who we are, even if they're conflicting sides to us, and to embrace our whole selves. Right? And hopefully that will lead us to better understand others and have compassion for their complexities as well. So one final thing I want to mention is that there's an Aboriginal scholar called Tyson Yunkaporta from the Appalachia clan in Australia, who said something very interesting. So he said, nothing can be known or even exist unless it is in relation to other things. Nothing can be known or even exist unless it is in relation to other things.
Thank you for repeating that. What do you think that means?
Yeah, so what Tyson meant is that those things that are connected are less important than the forces of connection between them.
Mm,
So if you looked at the different aspects of my identity that I just spoke about earlier, you have the ancestor piece that holds a violent history from the past. And at the same time, I'm also a descendant of a very industrious and hardworking people who made Japan one of the strongest economic forces and peaceful nation after World War II. And I also have my Asian heritage here, the model minority in this country. And yet I also have inherited whiteness, right? So here are these kind of four things, and what each holds is important. But what is more important, Tyson says, is to see what are the connections between them. What is the relationship between these four sort of conflicting aspects of who I am?
mhm,
And what is the relationship of these relative identities with the absolute
mm.
identity?
Whew.
And we can get really curious about what's going on with these relationships, right? If I have these five things, right? What are the forces within those connections? And I may be able to draw connections horizontally, vertically, or across this way. And Tyson says that we exist to form these relationships, which make up the energy that holds creation together. So we have a tendency to kind of oversimplify things by becoming very binary, making dualistic comparisons, and ignoring the complex and the very rich relationships that exist between and among things.
Mm. Oh, yeah. I'm just really appreciating that image, which is really what I saw was a web when you did that, right? When you were connecting the pieces, what I saw was a web. And there's a really, again, kind of classic Dharma teaching called the Indra's net, which comes from all the way back from Hinduism originally. And um, what it is this example of how we are all points. We're all nodes, right? We're specific points, but we're all interconnected, right? So if one part of a spider's web shakes, the rest of the web shakes. That's how the spider can be over here and detect that a fly has gotten trapped in the web. But this web, instead, this net, instead of capturing and potentially killing, is a web or a net in which each of us as nodes are mirrors. Sometimes they're said to be diamonds, like we're each a diamond in the net that reflects. And then I'd say from your description, each one of us is also an Indra's net in which all these facets of our identity, absolute, relative, are all reflecting off of each other. And the way that mirroring works is something has to be there to be reflected, right? And sometimes we can only see ourselves in a mirror or with someone who can mirror back to us. So it's a wonderful way of talking about what I was hearing in your description was richness, not
Mhm.
just these discrete points, but actually the interconnection was so much, as you said, relational richness. And this is really a lot of, y'all might be like, okay, but how does this actually tie to Karuna training? Like, nice talk, but how does this connect? And part of the answer, we'll talk more about that later, but part of the answer is that we do relational work, that the work comes through relationships with ourself and with each other. And that this image of the web, this image of the net, is really the only way that we can do a lot of the healing and knowing that we need, especially if we're going to do larger systemic work. We need to do it interpersonally and intrapersonally. So that gives us a way to have curiosity and space and groundedness and holding all these things together and expanding um, our capacity. Why am I spacing on the expression right now? Intensity capacity is the expression that Melissa Moore uses for that, right? So the amount of intensity we can work with. And as Naoko said in the beginning, this complexity gets intense, can get very intense, which again is the reason why a lot of communities will just try to bypass it. And we try to not bypass it. And first, I'm going to guide us through some movement. And the movement we're going to do is really quite simple and can be completely adapted. So if you are in a lot of pain today and the idea of getting up and moving your whole body is not available to you, then you can do it with a hand or even with a foot. So really adapt. If you're lying down and that's where you need to be, you can do it lying down. You can do this seated. And if moving at all doesn't feel available, then you can simply imagine. The image that I wanted to use was this web that we were talking about, the interconnected web of Indra's net, and letting ourselves go from being a kind of small node, ostensibly all by themselves, to being a part of the large web. So basically, getting as small as we can to becoming as big as we can. But I wanted to pepper in this kind of teaching that we've been working with, especially toward the end, of expanding large enough, increasing our capacity for paradox. So you can take it at your own pace, or you're welcome to watch and follow me if that feels better. So I'm going to go as tiny as I can. I've got a shoulder and a back injury right now, so I'm not going to scrunch down all the way. And I'm going to do this slowly because that makes it easier for me to track what's happening in my body. But again, you do your pace. Don't forget to breathe. Mhm. Only if you're inclined, you're welcome to go faster, to play with stopping at different sizes. You can stop partway. What happens when I'm a little expanded, but not all the way? And actually feel in your body. We're not just moving for the sake of moving. Notice as much as you can. Notice how it feels to stop partway versus being scrunched in or all the way open. I just got this idea. What happens if one side is scrunched and one is open? I'm halfway open and halfway scrunched. And notice if you have any value judgments coming up, that being scrunched is bad and open is good, or being scrunched is good and open is bad. Just notice, like we would in meditation, I have some opinions about this. And come back to what's happening now as much as you can. If you've been doing the half and half or partial, giving yourself that full expansion. One last time. And then coming back to neutral position, whatever, whether that's standing, seated, lying down. Maybe a little wiggle. My limbs are kind of shaky from having been expanded and contracted. Besides the Indra's net image, we actually talk a lot in Karuna training about expansion and contraction. We talk about oscillation, so oscillating between the self and other, between opening up and opening out, like we tend to do on a retreat program, and then shutting down and making sure that we're letting that natural process happen instead of judging or assessing what's good and what's bad. Okay. And come back to whatever position you'd like. So, this is a deceptively simple practice. One of the things that I have I have to learn again and again, as somebody who practices various mindfulness and contemplative traditions, is that when something seems easy and it seems simple, I think, oh, this isn't going to really, this won't do anything. Why should I even do this? So, just in case that skeptic pops up where you're like, really? That's what we're going to do? That's cool. Just recognize that's popping up and give it a try. See what happens. This is going to be a writing practice. And what we're going to do is Naoko and I will keep gently repeating the question, who are you? And you will answer on paper or page. If you're not able to write, like right now, my writing capabilities are limited because of my shoulder injury. You can say them out loud or just think them to yourself. But if it's possible, it's great to write it, even if you rip it up afterwards or recycle it. And what often happens is we start to see all of those nodes that we were talking about, that Naoko was talking about, right? These main identities inside of ourselves. And we'll do the practice for 5 minutes, which means that you'll probably get through the things that you're used to putting down, your demographics, the things that go on applications, the things that you answer when people ask you, and start getting into things that you might not expect. If random thoughts that don't appear connected to your identity, that are funny or weird or just seem discordant, just take a deep breath and include that too. So let your felt sense of who you are expand and allow in even contradictory identities and seemingly random ideas. So we will, say, who are you? Pause for a few beats while people write something down. And then we'll repeat, who are you? And you'll answer the question again. And you're just answering the same question again and again. Again, deceptively simple practice. What I always say to people when I teach writing is, you are welcome to disobey. So if you're like, you start writing, who am I? And you're like, screw this, I'm just going to keep writing and ignore you guys. Please don't worry about it. It's not like you have to do it exactly this way, but we're here to support you and keep reminding you, like during meditation practice, when you come back to the breath or coming back to your body, coming back to this question, who are you? And then we'll have a discussion afterwards, as involved as you want to be or not. Right? So you don't have to share anything about the process. This can be just for you. So take a moment to just re-land on the land that you're on, the earth. Some of us were naming that, how complicated and complex at least the human relationship to the earth is that we're on, a part of. Notice if your mind is already jumping ahead to answer the question again and again. And we will just start. And again, in the background, Naoko and I will just alternate saying, asking, who are you? And you will spend your time answering however it arises. Who are you?
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 And the last time, at least for now, who are you? Taking a moment to wrap up what you've been writing, if anything. Just notice coming back again to a sense of being connected to the earth, the land that you were on and made of and part of.
So the program runs from September this year to May of 2026. That's like 20 months. So it's a little shy of 2 years. And it begins on September 28th with a 7-day residential retreat in California. And the first retreat is basically on the foundations. So you'll be introduced to some of the key Karuna concepts and methodologies. There's a second retreat sort of mid-year next year. There we'll do kind of a deep dive into Maitri space awareness and compassionate exchange. These are two sort of cornerstone of Karuna practices. And there's a third and last retreat, which is the graduation week. And in between these retreats, we meet every month online on the third Saturday for 3 hours, and we focus on different topics. And we also augment that with pairing you with a study buddy. You'll be assigned a mentor. There'll be small group continuity groups, and also an online community forum. So there's lots of touch points, even if we'll be meeting online, aside from the 3 in-person retreats. So that's a very brief summary of the basic training program. And there's a lot of information on the website. There's also CEU credits for those of you who qualify for that.
Oh, thank you, everyone, so much. We got to have a very juicy conversation. We didn't ask you many questions in there, but you asked some questions after, and thank you for engaging in all the practices with us as well, and for being here however you were able to be here today. We really appreciate you. As I love, Naoko, what did you say during the description? I started the recording late, but there's no transformation in isolation. Ooh, that's, yeah, new slogan.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, our website has all the information about basic training. There's a whole application process and interview process that's all on that website. And there's also a information session video that we did. So please take a look at that as well. It's a very short video. And we really hope that you'll consider joining the program and become part of the Karuna family.
And if you are not able to do the upcoming program, we often have programs like this: Introduction to Contemplative Psychology, Karuna Lives, podcasts, and occasionally retreats that are open as well. The program's available to people who haven't done Karuna training. So please keep in touch.